Good morning, Dr. SARA WHITNEY.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining our podcast here at Nomadic. One of the things we wanted to focus on in the podcast series is sort of the developments in regenerative medicine and all the discussion about sort of gut health and the human microbiome. And what's interesting is that your profession has sort of been in this space. That's sort of a big part of what you practice is helping with that, and also in your particular practice, infusion therapy, which is what is I think is a very, very exciting practice. It's an exciting field. There are a lot of possibilities, and still, I'm constantly amazed. So few people know about these services. And when I talk to people, I still get a lot of people who ask me. They're very interested. Like they're not just casually interested. They're keenly interested. And I want to say specifically women of my age group are very, very keenly interested in this. Anyways, could you tell us a little about your background and then explain to us what is a naturopath?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. A naturopath is, it's a special it's a special profession that's similar to an MD, right? But we kind of varied way back when pharmaceuticals kind of came on board. But, really it's a doctor, right? It's a 4-year doctorate degree, postgraduate. I studied psychology beforehand. As my undergraduate, I always wanted to be a doctor. So I was planning to go to medical school and be an MD. I was raised in the Midwest. And so I didn't really know anything about a naturopath. I didn't really know that much about using herbal medicine or food as medicine or any of those concepts when I was growing up. But I did want to be a doctor. So I did all my pre-med kind of things. And then I had a friend who said, "You should be a naturopath." I said, "Wow, what's that?" And she told me, and, when she told me and said, they don't prescribe drugs, I said, wow, I don't think that, that's a viable profession because I don't know anybody who wants to change their lifestyle in the Midwest.
Yeah.
I was willing to, and I was curious. And she brought me to, see a practitioner, but, it included changing my diet, which I thought was kind of fascinating. And the way that I felt after 2 weeks of being on it was a Candida diet back then, which was a very low sugar diet. Right. And I had so much energy. I felt incredible, so clear. I just couldn't believe it. So I started to look into it more. I realized that it was a medical school, so it was going to be kind of satisfy my desire for 4 more years of school. And I started looking at the schools. So we only have, I think, about 7 schools in the United States. There's 2 in Canada. So
Wow,
very limited, profession at this point, but we continue to grow. And I think we continue to grow because of the internet and because people are seeking out solutions that they're not given in their normal kind of primary care visits. And so I wish that everybody, had access to a naturopathic doctor. I wish that people, knew what we did more. Because I think a lot of people would choose to see us if they knew, of an option. A lot of people just don't know. So
no, they still don't know. It's amazing.
Yeah. And so, I went in because I was very interested in the diet portion, so nutrition. And when I looked up major medical schools, like the Mayo is a top medical school in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Nutrition was an elective. So it was not part of their curriculum. You could take a nutrition class, but you didn't have to. And after I had done that Candida diet, I was just very convinced that, what we put into our body makes a difference. I also struggled with acne through my teenage years and early 20s. And, I went to the dermatologist. I did everything they said. I took all the antibiotics, and it didn't get better. And so I was frustrated on my own health journey, which, is a fairly insignificant, I feel like, problem, just acne. But, it was all over my face and I didn't like it. And so, I was motivated to do whatever it took. And, I felt like I had kind of exhausted all their options. And so when I found out that diet, and I remember telling my parents, it's got to be something I'm eating that's coming out my skin. But this concept was just not, they did not believe it. It was
Isn't it
definitely,
amazing?
no,
How
you're just
long did it take
producing,
them? Yeah.
yeah, you're just producing too much oil. It's like,
Yeah.
I just didn't
It's
buy it. And so, I've always been a very curious person. Um, I'm willing to kind of look for the answer and figure it out. And so, yeah, I went to naturopathic school, and it's very similar to MD school. The first 2 years are almost identical. So very heavy in sciences, anatomy, physiology, histology. We do all the same things. But then in the second 2 years, instead of going to hospitals and working, we work in our own clinic. We see patients under the supervision of our different doctors. And then we start to study all the same gynecology, rheumatology, psychology. And we just learn it a little different way. So we, instead of only using drugs and surgery, which is what medical doctors are given as their tools, we start to learn botanical medicine. We learn nutrition. We learn hands-on techniques, everything from massage up to chiropractic adjustments. We learn lifestyle counseling, which I think is kind of the biggest thing that we do, and then homeopathy.
Yeah.
But with that lifestyle counseling, that really fit into my psychology kind of background and really working with people, because changing your diet is not easy.
No.
It's a very
Right.
cultural thing. It's a very thing that gives people a lot of comfort. It's social. It's all these different things.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't realize that the food has changed through the years. So
Yeah.
if you used to eat Campbell's soup, in the 1950s, the label is definitely different. I mean, their branding is the same, but if you start to read the ingredients in the back, it's very different. And so food has changed. Food has become chemicals, pesticides, things like that. And so changing your diet takes a lot of work. So I love that we learned all this counseling, because to try to help people make changes like that, it's not just, go home and lose 20 pounds, right? We'll see cardiologists do that a lot to people. Like, you have high blood pressure, you're going to need to be on this high blood pressure medicine, but maybe you can go home and lose 50 pounds before your next visit. Well, that's easier said than done,
Yeah.
and so a lot of times, people end up on the medicine. And so, we really have these different tools in our tool belt, we like to call it, of looking at problems, looking at solutions, offering different things to people. But then we also do learn from pharmacology. So we can prescribe drugs. In different states, we are licensed differently. So
Right.
in some states, we can prescribe all pharmaceuticals. In other states, we can only prescribe limited amounts. So that really varies state to state. But, the fact that we have all this knowledge of different options. So a lot of times with people with chronic conditions, they're stuck on a medicine. Things aren't really getting better. It's kind of a Band-Aid. We can really help people come off of those meds, find different solutions, and maybe actually heal from that chronic illness by making some significant changes.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about the food changing, because I recently looked. I haven't had pop. I used to consume a lot of junk food when I was a teenager, and I was so sick, and I had severe acne too. And when I got to college, I thought, so I started hanging out in these health food stores, but I literally have not had a can of soda for like a billion years, and it used to be 26 grams of sugar. And now these soda cans, the same 12-ounce cans, are 58 to 60 grams of sugar. They've
Wow.
literally doubled the sugars. I mean, I can't imagine that you can taste the difference.
Yeah.
But that is like, I don't know but that can't be healthy the way that some people consume soda.
Yeah. Well, and now too, a 12-ounce can is small, right? I mean, you see these
Yeah,
big
that's
gulps,
right. They're a
that's
lot bigger.
32 ounces,
Yep. Yep.
and that people don't even just consume one a day, right? So, obviously diabetes is on the rise. We see childhood diabetes now more than ever. The food has definitely changed. It's made to be addictive. They put in those sugars because it's a chemical signal to the body, to want more, to want more.
Yeah, it's an addiction. Yeah,
It is.
exactly.
And it's sad because, people fall into it, kids fall into it. There's definitely a socioeconomic aspect to it too. People think healthy food costs more. I think there is, on some level, yes, maybe if you're just going to a restaurant, but, cooking vegetables, cooking your own food is definitely in the long run cheaper than, eating out, eating,
Yeah,
fast food, places like that, because you pay for it on the backside with your health.
right. And that goes back to the lifestyle thing, because
Right.
switching to this does require some sort of organization and, setup, and
Yeah,
that's
it takes time.
that can be a
Learning.
lot for people to manage. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And, I think it helps to, where your family is involved, right? And other people. And so I've noticed in my practice too, it becomes almost like a family practice. So, people will
Yeah.
bring in their spouse, they'll bring in their kids, they'll bring in, their sisters, because, the more that your family is on board, or even your friends or your circles, right? It's
Yeah.
easier to make those choices and changes.
Yeah. Yeah, the alcohol is a big one. I've had so many people, I stopped drinking and my friends don't want to hang out with me anymore.
Yeah. People don't like it when you change.
They don't.
It makes them
Uh,
uncomfortable.
so now I did look at, so you have a really interesting background because you've worked in environmental medicine.
Mhm.
And as you, of course, you have the naturopath background, but it's sort of interesting how, like, when I look at now, there's this sort of, they call it the innovative movement, which is towards like regenerative medicine, um, and personalized medicine, right? And a lot of that infusion therapy sort of falls right in the middle of that. Can you talk about how you sort of developed your infusion therapy practice and what made you interested in it?
Yeah, definitely. So I never set out to be, having infusions as my main thing, when I went to school. I definitely took a class and learned IV therapy, but I wasn't really, oh, this is the only way. But when I got into treating more complex chronic illness, which is kind of what we call, an umbrella term for different conditions that, they can range from autoimmune to tick-borne stuff, Lyme disease, sometimes even cancer, things like that, right? You usually don't have one thing. And so there's a multiple, kind of spectrum of illnesses that are going on. And when that happens, naturopathic doctors have always believed everything starts in the gut. So all illnesses, whether they're neurological or rheumatological, they start in the gut. Obviously, GI stuff we've always known, Crohn's
Right.
disease is in the gut. But, our gut is what's going to absorb everything, take everything in, good and bad, right? And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
we can get, infections there, we can get, pesticides absorbed, things like that. So when I started treating these conditions, it really benefits people to use infusion therapy because it bypasses the gut. And so as we're doing things to help heal the gut, which does take a little while, it takes time to change that diet. Sometimes it takes time to figure out what's irritating the gut. A lot of
Yeah.
people, I mean, 9 times out of 10, when I ask people how is their diet, they say good. But, that's the thing, food allergies can come from foods that are healthy. Something in the gut is not happy with something. It doesn't mean that that's an unhealthy food always. So sometimes it takes time to tease out what's going on in the gut, what went wrong. Is it, a pathogen? Is it food allergies? Is it another medication? Birth control has a big effect on the gut,
Yeah.
steroids, things like that. So medicines people have maybe been on for years. So you start to kind of tease that out. And in the meantime, if you use infusion therapy, you're still getting all this good stuff in to start changing kind of the trajectory of the chronic disease. And so
I see.
that really, spoke to me that, it's not just this fast, easy way to feel good, but it
Right.
does do that too. And so that's kind of nice when you have a chronic illness, if you get a treatment and you kind of feel good for a day or two,
Right.
that's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's really kind of changing the way someone can feel, and maybe it doesn't last right away, but it's still kind of that hope of like, wow, maybe I can start to feel good. Because if you start taking a lot of medicines or even supplements, down through the gut, and your gut is inflamed, how much are you really absorbing? We don't even know, people, I see people come in, they have, 30 different supplements they're taking. Well, are those
Right.
even getting digested and absorbed? We don't know. But when we put it into the vein, we know it's getting in, and so we
Right.
bypass that whole digestive system. And
Yeah.
that's not because we're ignoring the digestive system. It's
Yeah.
because we need time to heal that digestive system. And so in the meantime, we use the infusions. The first doctor I worked for, who was an environmental medicine specialist, he was a medical doctor. He used a lot of infusions for chelation, and that's a process of getting heavy metal toxins out of the body. And so that was a weekly treatment that people would come in and get. And so through working with him, I saw a lot of people who did have complex chronic illness. So they maybe didn't even have good veins, but we would
Mhm.
try and we would, get access. We would do these treatments, and slowly over time, you would start to see that heavy metal burden come down, which then starts to allow the immune system to work better. So you're removing the toxins through the infusions. But then, there's also infusions that are just nutritive. So we're giving, vitamins. And again,
Right.
if things aren't getting absorbed in the gut, we know we can get them absorbed that way. So, vitamin C, B vitamins, minerals. My favorite is glutathione. That is antioxidant that we need to process toxins and get them out of our body. And so we make glutathione, but as we're sick or as we're aging, we're not making as much. And so,
Yeah.
we're giving it. It's also a very delicate molecule, so it's not easy to take it as a supplement. And so it's much more effective to put it into the vein. So it kind of just came about as a way to really help people get better faster. And being in Los Angeles, where I first started practicing, it kind of at first was looked at as kind of an elitist, almost, kind of
Yeah.
treatment.
Right.
But,
Right.
fast forward a decade now, we have lots of places to get IVs. A lot of them are more geared towards hangovers, which
Right. Yeah.
I think that started in Vegas, where, you would call a nurse to come by. They would give you a big bag of basically saline and maybe some
Yeah.
Zofran for the nausea.
Yeah.
But, we like to give, more, vitamins, high quality, not full of preservatives. So much more quality getting in to really treat illness.
Yeah. Well, I did want to sort of put my 2 cents in on that because I certainly worked around all this, for a while, but I never understood until I actually had my first Myers cocktail. And I was sick when I came in for that. And literally by the end of the IV drip, I felt so much better. And then I just like, I couldn't believe how much better I felt. And sometimes I would have them back to back, two consecutive days. But it just, over the course of the year, it changed my health dramatically. I mean, not just like, I can't explain to you, even when I get the IV drip, it must be that I have some sort of absorption problems or something. I do know that it helps my asthma and my
Hmm.
bronchitis, specifically, and that's been a very difficult problem for me, especially here. But yeah, I always tell people they have to try it because I think if it benefits you, it can benefit you dramatically. Um, and the other thing is that I always tell people, which I think most people don't understand, is that a lot of you buy supplements, people kind of buy supplements randomly and kind of blindly, or if they have a recommendation from a friend or a family member, or they read something somewhere. But I do try to encourage them because naturopaths actually have access to some very good supplements. And I think the efficacy for the supplements, the brands that they use, are more, they're reliable. And it's, I think also there are a whole series of tests that you guys do that you can test people's nutritional deficiencies that most people aren't aware of. They don't
Yep.
know that they can go and find that out about themselves instead of, trial and error. Someone can actually tell them and then put them on a program.
Yeah, definitely. I think, testing is very key for a lot of people to really figure out, what is it they're deficient in,
Yeah.
and, tailor that. And that's, that personalized medicine. That's a tenet of naturopathic medicine, right? It's,
Yeah.
so we learn that in school. You treat the individual, and even, to the point of labs, when we test basic labs through LabCorp or Quest, most medical
Right.
doctors are running those kinds of tests. But there's a range. And, that
Yeah.
range is kind of, what everybody goes off of. But, if
Yeah.
someone comes in and tells me, they're still losing their hair, they started thyroid medicine, but their hair is still falling out, but they're in range, so the doctor won't give them any more thyroid hormone. It's like, well, obviously they need more, and
Yeah.
so just not always thinking that, everybody is going to fit into this range. That range
Yeah.
is based on a certain cohort of people,
Yeah.
and you have
Yeah.
to treat the person, not the labs, not,
Yeah.
not the protocol, right? And so
Right.
I have a lot of sensitive patients too, people who, they don't need much and they
Yeah.
feel something. And so again, it's like you don't need to give them the highest dose of something. They might just
Right.
need a little bit. And I think
Yeah.
us learning botanical medicine and homeopathy, which is, such an interesting system of medicine too, where, less is more basically.
Yes, exactly. I was quite shocked about that with homeopathy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it kind of opens us up to realize that, this kind of idea we've been sold in Western medicine that, everybody needs the same 7 days of an antibiotic, right? And it's like, yeah, in their testing, that is probably what killed the pathogen the best, right? And so,
Right.
but, you have to listen to people. And that's, one
Yeah.
of the best things, that I learned in school is just to listen, because a lot of times people, they have an idea of what's wrong, but they don't, they didn't study the body for 4 years and in and out and
Right.
all the, pathways and stuff. And so, but if you can listen to what they're saying, you can really kind of troubleshoot with them and kind of figure things out. But yeah, I definitely love it when people are willing to, pay money for testing. That makes it a lot easier. But the beauty about the Myers cocktail, that kind of basic IV, which is full of vitamins and minerals,
Yeah.
is that it helps so many people. So many people will come back saying, wow, I slept so good. Wow, I
Yeah.
had more energy. And, I
Yeah.
think when we can affect the sleep, that's when our body is repairing and healing on its own too. And, one of the other, tenets of naturopathic medicine is that the body wants to heal, and that there is this innate ability for it to heal. And,
Yeah.
we really use that philosophy because we're not trying to, I don't heal the body, right? I might remove toxins, I might give nutrients, I might educate someone on diet, but, it's their body that's really going to heal.
Yeah.
And, we know because when we cut ourselves, we apply pressure, maybe stop the bleeding, but after that, we don't even consciously have to think about the body making a scar and healing.
Right.
It
Yeah.
does it. And
Does it
so,
on its own. Yeah.
sometimes it's like getting out of the way, really educating people how we're going to, work with the body
Yeah.
instead of suppress the body or force the body. And I think,
Right.
as people, those are very easy things to understand, right? Because, we've all been in these bodies, but it kind of blows my mind that Western medicine doesn't talk about that and use that, and from their
Yeah.
perspective, they're going to do the healing. The medicine is going to heal you, whatever treatment is going to be the force. And we really believe the force is already within us. And that to me made a lot of sense in school. And really, I see it in practice all the time because,
Well,
we're amazing,
exactly. I mean, I think that's sort of the power of this idea of regenerative medicine, right? The fact is,
Exactly.
you have this creation, which is your body, which is really amazing. I mean, I've worked with institutionalized not well, I've worked with institutions that have done deep research in immunology, and the more that you learn about what your immune system is and what your body, what your body is capable of doing and how it can regenerate itself, it's really like you can't, it seems like it's a better philosophy to work with that and try to understand it and optimize it as opposed to sort of trying to do something else,
Right.
And that's not to say, of course, if I were if I broke a leg, I would go to see an orthopedic doctor and, get the leg mended. Of course, there's definitely value to that approach, but it's
Yes.
not the only approach. And I think that's what's happening now, as research has come out about gut health and how important that is and how it sort of is connected to so many other things.
Yeah.
I was shocked that like it was connected to your oral health, right? Your dental health. I mean, that's really shocking. I mean, it shouldn't be shocking, but how much it impacts that's really shocking.
Well, I think what's shocking is the dentists, haven't been talking about that, right? Haven't been
Yeah.
talking about the gut because
Right.
when they separated the mouth from the body,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what they did. And so, I work with a dentist who she sends me most of her patients because she sees decay, she sees
Yeah.
things in the mouth. She says, you got to get your gut looked at. And,
Yeah.
patients are so grateful because, instead of one procedure after the next in their mouth,
Yeah.
they start addressing, the deeper issue. And I think,
Right.
with the regenerative medicine, yeah, it's like stem cells, things like that, that's all copying the body.
Right.
Peptides are copying the proteins that the body makes. It's,
Yeah.
we're copying the wisdom of the body. And so,
Right.
and with the gut health, the immune system lies in the gut.
Yeah.
And so, anytime we have, an illness or anything like that, it's like, yeah, we can focus on the gut and what are we putting in, and or even sometimes even what are we not putting in. So, the power of fasting,
Oh, yes.
and how
Yes.
that's been in cultures for, eons, right?
Right.
It
Right.
was one of the first places I interned at was a fasting clinic, people
Yeah.
came to drink water and it was incredible, diabetes reversed, autoimmune diseases reversed by just pausing and not putting stuff in to give
Yeah.
that body time to rest and regenerate on its own. And so, regenerative medicine is, to me, kind of so naturopathic. And,
Yeah. Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
very, trendy, right?
Yes.
With
It's
functional medicine and regenerative medicine.
we've
But
come full circle now. Yes.
yes, but it's very much, looking to the body again, and how do we heal? How do we get the body to kind of do what it was supposed to be doing instead of
Right.
just, oh, we're aging. And, a lot of times doctors have used that as a reason why you have a problem, for, oh, you're getting more tired, you're this, you're slowing down, it's your age. But really, you see these other people who are in their 90s and they're still, downhill skiing. They're,
Yes. Yes. I've met these
trekking.
people,
Yeah. And,
and they look amazing. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, they definitely probably got a little bit lucky in the genetic world, right? And so they got some good genetics, but, most likely too, they have continued to, nourish their body, exercise, sleep well, have
Yeah.
healthy relationships. These
Yeah.
are all, the basics of health. And, it's not, a pharmaceutical patent, right? To get good
Right.
sleep and things
Right.
like that. But, our industrial society, and I think too, the biggest one lately has been all the Wi-Fi, and
Oh, yeah.
the EMFs,
Yeah.
it's that, they're in every home now, they're in every building, they're, people are sleeping next to their modem. It's like, that's going to disrupt your sleep. That's going to disrupt your cellular communication. And suddenly you have, degenerative illness,
Yeah.
because it is, the body sees it as an attack. And so, there's things that
It
are
responds. Yep.
yeah, people sleep with their phones. That's one of my number one things, teenagers saying you got to plug that phone in, not in your bedroom. Turn it on Wi-Fi, or excuse me, turn it on airplane mode, right? It's
Yeah.
like, people are like, oh, but it's my alarm clock. It's like, well, go buy a battery, alarm clock again. It's like, it doesn't need to be. It's not good for, our health. We
Yeah.
need a dark room to sleep.
Yeah.
We can't have all these lights and things. They disrupt our hormones.
Yeah.
And so, it really
Yeah.
goes back to, kind of natural, living in nature, right? Even in the winter months when it's dark so early, I think that's our time to, sleep more and
Right.
really, hibernate a little bit.
Yeah. And I think, of course, there's so many studies now about how important sleep is, which
Yeah.
we didn't really understand before. And so I did want to ask you, because I wanted to talk about this. A long time ago, I attended a conference and there was a talk. So I'm not going to name any names, but there was a lecture that I went to. I was so fascinated by this. Like, the topic was the role of genetics in randomized clinical trials. And of course, RCTs they're the foundation of pharmacological medicine. Western medicine, a lot of the research is founded on this, but I didn't even think about that. Like what is it actually doing? It's sort of bringing us all to this common denominator. Um, and in fact, we know the role of genetics. We know how genetics is so key to what our future medical history was. I didn't believe this until I was 36 and I had the same surgery my mom had when she was at 36. It was so shocking to me because we don't even look alike, It's like, I'm like, how could I don't have any of your health issues. I don't, but right at 36, I had the same surgery, the same health issue. Um, so can you talk about, your interest in genetics and how you think that impacts sort of health outcomes?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think genetics is fascinating. I always have, when I first took my first genetics class. But I also think, when I got into environmental medicine, we use this kind of term or this phrase that genetics will cock the gun, but environment pulls the trigger, right? So it does
Oh,
kind of lay the foundation. But then
right.
we have this thing called epigenetics. And epigenetics is how we can turn on and off certain genes that we have. So, the epigenetics comes in with the diet,
Wow.
with the lifestyle. So you can
Huh.
be, kind of programmed to get a certain illness, when you turn 40, right?
Right.
But if you kind of change that trajectory by, eating healthy and different things like that, you can have it not happen. And so that was really fascinating to me because I think genetics makes people feel like they're doomed sometimes. Some
Yeah.
people obviously win the genetic lottery. We see
Right.
um, or they seem to have. But, I've also learned in Los Angeles to not judge, people by their appearances so much because, some of these people still have internal problems. They have,
Right.
worries, they have things like that. But,
Yeah.
genetics, yes, it's even how we think cancer, it seems like it runs in families. But it's a lot of times it's the environment because you grew up in the same home, you grew up eating the same food.
Yeah.
Your house was maybe near that dry cleaner or near that power plant or near something else. And so, it looks like it's coming through the genetics, but it actually might be coming through the environment. And so that kind of gave me a lot of hope for people. The other
Yeah.
thing that really was popular when I first got into practice was MTHFR, which is a gene, a SNP, they call it. And it's a mutation in a process in our body called methylation. And so there was a man who went to my school, Dr. Ben Lynch, and he kind of educated the world about this gene, this SNP. And so it's called MTHFR. And what it does is it impairs our ability to methylate in the body. And methylation is just a process where B vitamins turn on and off. And so you're kind of recycling them in the body. And that will help
Oh.
detoxify things. So when people have these SNPs, they definitely are not as good at detoxifying, which then leads to illness. And
Yeah.
so when I was first in practice, we tested almost everybody, their genetics. And, we could see these people who had been struggling with their health for 20, 30 years, they didn't detoxify as well as other people. So they had these genes. So in order to mitigate that, they had to be more careful with their diet. They had to be more careful with their exposures. They
Right.
had to maybe take more supplements to help. But, then they can kind of, help that process and get better. But they're kind
Yeah.
of those people who would say, all my friends, they can drink alcohol, they can do this, and they're fine. I have one little drink and, I'm in bed for 3 days. Or, my spouse can do this, or, whoever. And so I really started using genetics in that way to help people understand that they got dealt a different hand.
Yeah.
And, it's not to say that like you can't get better or you're going to be sick forever, but you have to be more careful. You
Yeah.
have to maybe, work at your health a little more. You need to get those 8 hours of sleep a night, where maybe your partner can go on 6. He can drink
Yeah.
coffee all day and be okay. But you got a different, set of genetics. And it's not
Right.
a death sentence. It
Yeah.
just takes a little bit more, a little bit more thought. And, I think it really helped people to see that because it was an answer. Because, people start to feel like, they're to blame, or why can't they just, be
Yeah.
the same as this other person? And it is,
Yeah.
some people, get born with different problems. There's a lot of illnesses and conditions are, developmental. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, those people have more challenges. It doesn't mean they don't have a good life, in the long
Yeah.
run, right?
Right.
But it really does help people to understand why they're struggling, or why, when they go into a home, they're sick from the chemicals, and
Yeah.
someone else detoxes it just fine. So when
Yeah.
MTHFR got really popular, I was going to genetic conferences, I was learning about it, and it really served my practice well to kind of help people understand why they struggle. Because, nobody wants to struggle. Everybody, it's much better when things go smooth and it's, easy, but it really does. And, of course, before I even checked my genetics, I knew that I had some of these SNPs because, when I would read the reports to people, a lot of the methylation SNPs end up looking like mental health things in the body. So they look like
Oh,
depression, anxiety, insomnia, narcolepsy, things like that. And
right.
I knew from, my family that depression ran in our family. And,
Yeah.
I only found that out when I experienced it. Then they kind of told me, oh, hey, yeah, like that's part of our family. And so I knew
Right.
before I even checked my genetics that I had those SNPs. And of course, later on in practice, when I had some more funds, I ran the genetic tests, and yeah, I have the SNPs. And so, but I could see it. And, a lot of those conditions are ones people don't like to talk about, the
Right.
depression, anxiety, the mental health kind of stigma. But,
Right.
downstream of that, a lot of times is detoxification. And so, it's our bodies are getting full of toxins. One of them, too, the way that we can methylate better if people have these SNPs is to remove gluten from the diet. Because gluten, especially in America, is fortified. And so enriched wheat flour is flour that's been bleached. And then they add in
Oh,
synthetic B vitamins.
interesting.
And so folic acid is part of what messes up the methylation. So if you're not a good methylator and you're eating a lot of gluten, that's going to slow down the process even more. So, one of the treatments is to remove that from the diet. And then, you can add in some of the more, quality B vitamins. And, suddenly, you're not as sleepy, or you're more mentally clear, your mood is more stable.
Right.
And so, there's fixes to it, but, people like when they can see a problem and then a solution. It's much better than, being dismissed by a doctor as like, I don't know what's wrong with you. It's all in your head, or, we don't have a reason. All your labs look fine. And a lot of people hear that because, basic labs will look fine, but
Right.
they don't feel
Right.
good. And,
No.
they've kind of learned to just go on, or, they're taking psych drugs, to mitigate or kind of help their mood or help them sleep, but, a lot of things can be answered by doing some simple genetic testing. And now, of course, it's expanded so much. There's, so much you can look at genetically. But again, it really does help people understand why they're feeling the way they are.
Yeah. Well, and I want to say, is that why, like, sometimes, when I had some depression, I actually started running. I just
Mm,
decided that I was done with the treatment. And that I felt well, it wasn't just the running. I was running outside in the sun. And the combination just sort of, like, a lot of it just sort of cleared up.
yeah.
Um, and it would have never happened if I had not become a SoCal person. Because that's the whole lifestyle there, It's like,
Definitely.
but it really changed a lot for me dramatically, and improved my health and my sleep and
Well, exercise, of course, is going to, yeah, help us sleep better. Exercise is going to make us sweat, which is another way we're going to get toxins out. And then the
right,
vitamin D factor, I mean, we're taught at this point to fear the sun, you
yeah,
know, put
right,
on all these chemical sunblocks, all these things, but really the sun is so powerful. Vitamin D, I think, has so many roles in the body. And so you changed, right? You started
right,
running, you started getting in the sun, and those kinds
yeah,
of things, are going to help push out, whatever was probably causing that depression, which was probably, some toxins. The other thing,
right,
they see in the northern hemisphere with that low vitamin D is, increase, MS, different illnesses,
Oh,
are in a higher prevalence in the northern hemispheres. And that was always interesting to me growing up in North Dakota,
yeah.
because we don't see the sun as much, right? We don't have all
No.
the months. And so,
Yeah.
of course people are lower, and, now people can supplement vitamin D, but there's nothing like the sun,
Yeah,
it's
there's this,
not the
I
same.
mean, for me, like I would have never believed it except that I moved out of this environment, right? And I went to Sun Country and was there for a long time. And it changed, like it cleared my skin up, cleared everything. I mean, my whole health changed. I was like a different person down there. And even my recent visit down to LA, I could feel it again the minute I landed with all that sun coming out in the day.
Yeah.
So I think that, I definitely believe that it's a real thing, the vitamin D, the sun factor. So can you talk also about environmental medicine? Because I do think, you know, um, obviously our podcast is about sustainability, but there's a very different perspective from environmental medicine about what a lot of these illnesses are um, that we experience as a modern society, right? I think it's an
Definitely.
interesting.
Yeah, I was very intrigued by environmental medicine, I think, because it's things that make us sick in the environment, right? And
Yeah,
so, that can look like food allergies. It can look like environmental allergies, which a lot of people suffer from. It's very miserable, hay fever, things like that.
yeah,
Then you get into more, of the real toxins. So, the heavy metals, lead, mercury, these are things found in our environment that make people sick. And again, it's, they don't make everybody sick, because some
right.
people have better genetics and they
Yeah,
detox those things better, right? And then other
yeah,
people, you know, never had mercury fillings in their mouth because they had stronger teeth, right? Or they had
yeah,
a better dentist who
right.
didn't, put in unnecessary fillings.
Yeah.
So, I found it really interesting when I was first pregnant, and, found out that they won't put in a mercury filling when you're pregnant, for
Oh,
fear of the mercury going to the
oh,
baby. But,
interesting.
as soon as you have that baby, they'll put it right back in your mouth. And it's so bizarre to me because, I think for years they must have thought it wasn't very much, right? It wasn't enough to make you sick.
Yeah,
But,
yeah,
you know, you put it in your mouth every time you're eating something hot or whatever, there's some vapor, and, that's going right up into the brain. So
yeah.
these things definitely make us sick. Lead was much more prevalent in the environment, leaded paints, leaded gasoline.
Right.
They check,
Asbestos.
yeah,
Yeah,
asbestos. With the lead, they check all 2-year-olds, for lead poisoning because it's
yeah,
still, in old homes, it's in soil.
yeah.
Yeah, asbestos. I'll never forget when my ceiling crashed in and I came to
I
work, and
remember that.
that might have asbestos. And I had no idea. Went home, got it tested. It sure did, and I was pregnant.
Yeah.
So it was like, I can't
Oh,
live here,
yeah.
And so,
Right.
these things that we've used in it, in our industrialized ways, and,
Right.
they're good for certain things, right? Those
Yeah.
dentists like that mercury in the tooth. It's a strong metal, and but I think it
These
ends.
are all manufacturing decisions, right? They're
Yeah.
manufacturing and business decisions ultimately. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the health of the people isn't always the health of the environment isn't always,
Right.
considered. And I think back when like Silent Spring was written, right? And the rivers and, industrial pollution, it's like,
Right.
oh, we'll just put it in the river and it'll wash away. Like, oh well, if some fish die. And that really was always fascinating to me, just kind of all these things in our environment that, can make people sick, and then
There.
you add in, the infections. So,
Right.
Lyme disease, things like that. You get bit by a tick. I love being outside, love hiking, but it pays to do a tick check after you've been out hiking, because if you can remove those and, find them, rather than 10 years later, you can't figure out your mystery illness. It's
Right.
like, those things all play a role. So the environmental medicine piece is a big part of medicine that I think is overlooked, because a lot of times they're just testing your body. They're not really considering, your home. The other thing that is,
Yeah.
I didn't really learn that much about in school, but moving to Southern California, I would have never thought mold would be a problem. But it's very difficult to find a home in Los Angeles that doesn't have mold.
Oh my
And
gosh, that's shocking.
yeah, and I think, because of our dry environment here, people don't think of it, but
Right.
people always tell me, "Oh, it's a new building, Dr. Sarah, like it can't have mold." And I'm like, "But it can, because if they didn't put the correct fitting on your sink, behind the wall, it's leaking, that can
Yeah.
create mold,
Oh
so
yeah.
a lot of times it's hidden behind walls, but then
Right.
though in these older buildings, it'll be a leak. You'll see it when it rains, but then it doesn't rain for 8 months, so they paint over it. You might get
Yeah.
sick, but your doctor never tells you, to look in your home, right? They
Yeah.
just start treating you or naming whatever, degenerative disease you might now have,
Yeah.
with a nice name, and then they start treating that disease, but they don't really look for that underlying reason. I always tell people, if you get a diagnosis like MS or Parkinson's, there's really no discussion on why you got it or how you got it. It's just more of a treatment. And so, with environmental medicine, those are huge things I'm always looking at. It doesn't matter what the illness name is. If they already have a diagnosis, it's why. Why did the body start malfunctioning? Why did the body start, quote unquote, attacking itself like an autoimmune, right? It's
Yeah.
like
Right.
likely your body didn't just start, hating on your thyroid. It's There's something there it's trying to deal with, and a lot of times
Yeah.
with thyroid illness, it's from the teeth, right? So
Oh,
when the
interesting.
teeth can drain right here, the thyroid is the closest to the surface gland, so it gets
Wow.
hit, hard, early on. It's one of the most common autoimmune diseases.
Right.
Um, but then, we have other illnesses like with your asthma, in childhood, in kids, we see a lot of eczema. And so
Yeah.
then in eczema, the standard of care treatment is a topical steroid. So you put that steroid on your skin, the eczema goes away. But if that
Yeah.
eczema was, kind of a manifestation of maybe a dairy allergy or a dairy sensitivity causing kind of an inflammation, well, you didn't stop eating dairy, so you just
Yeah.
suppress the eczema to go deeper. So then a
Right.
lot of times in a year or two, we see the kids develop asthma, which is a
Oh.
much
Oh.
more,
Interesting.
deeper illness.
Yeah.
And, again, you have to use steroids, but more like inhaled steroids. But yeah,
Yeah.
it all maybe came back to eating dairy or eating another food that was causing upset. And so, you know, with environmental medicine, I have the ability to look at food, to look at infections, to look at toxins, to just really try to figure out what is upsetting the body. Because one of our tenets in naturopathic medicine is to remove the obstacle to cure, because the body is trying to heal. So there's some sort of obstacle in its way. And a lot of times that is a toxin or an infection. And people, or a dental thing, right? And
Yeah.
so,
Right.
we also have these things, root canals don't get properly cleaned, and they just kind of kill the nerve and pack it. So there's, some infection that stays with the body,
Oh,
drains the immune
interesting.
system, then we have
Yeah.
these things called
I didn't realize that.
cavitations, which
Oh
are
gosh.
pockets. Like if you got your wisdom teeth or other teeth removed, that might not
Yeah.
always heal. That can harbor infection and
Oh
toxin
my gosh.
and really be draining the immune system over the years. And so really, it's definitely detective work. Most
Yeah.
people, if you ask them these questions, it's like, people don't remember being bit by a tick. They usually, I have to look in their mouth to find out how many mercury fillings they have. Most people don't really even know. They might know if they have root canals,
Yeah.
but it's kind of weird to people to kind of be like, "Oh, I think you need to go get the mercury out of your mouth before we can, address your dementia, right? Or, your
Right.
forgetfulness or your brain fog, is kind of what it's called in the earlier, symptoms. Is like, I just am not as sharp. And, a lot of times normal doctors, they look, your labs look fine. Oh, you must just be getting older. Maybe you're stressed, get more sleep. But really, when we remove these things from the body,
Yeah.
then, the healing starts. The healing is kind of natural once you remove that obstacle. And so, yeah,
Well,
I
and I think that that's, yeah, I mean, one of the biggest differences is, of course, one kind of medicine is a disease-oriented medicine. It's treating, a disease, and it's looking for an onset of a disease. And the other is really for optimal health, right? And there is a whole, like, I want to say there is a divide in the population. There is a population out there that really wants to achieve optimal health. That really wants to have improved quality of life in their, day. They can see the difference. They understand what it means to them and the benefits of it, and they're really reaching for that. And that's why, I think it's kind of, hopefully it's a very exciting time in medicine, especially for someone like you, you seem to sort of be at the intersection of all these different modes of, treating patients. And one thing I did want to mention is that in Washington State, thanks to our commissioner, one of our former commissioners, Deborah Sen, you can actually choose a naturopathic doctor as your primary care. And that was really, when I learned that was the only thing for me, because, just because I discovered what a naturopath can do. But I think a lot of people don't know that. And I try to tell people wherever I go, they're just a lot of, I feel that there are a lot more, there's a lot more in their toolkit. It's much broader. And you have a lot of, I remember the first time that I went to see a naturopath, he was asking me all these questions about specifically what my health is. I'm like, wow, how did he know that? Does he ask all his patients these questions, or did he just know that those were my problems? It was kind of, because he was asking about gut health and digestive issues. And you don't actually get those kind of questions from other practitioners that you see.
Well, we really focus on prevention, right? And so,
right.
Whereas other
Right.
doctors are waiting for you to kind of develop that disease,
Right.
we're really
Right.
looking at trends in the blood work, oh, you're trending towards this. Let's intervene now and,
Right.
make the changes now before we have, that disease. And I think that, we need that so much in healthcare, because it is much easier to prevent than it is to, kind of peel that onion back and get to the bottom of, a chronic illness. But that's kind of why in my practice, I like to have some of both. I like to have those people who are just, they're optimizing, and they're the prevention, and they're, committed. And then the people who we're really trying to figure out, how to get them well, because it's pretty sad. It's sad when people lose multiple years of their life to an illness, especially a mystery illness that, because a lot of times these mystery illnesses, you don't get a lot of support. People kind of look to you like, why aren't you better yet? Why haven't you just taken a medicine and gotten better? And until it happens to you, or, someone in your family, it's very hard to understand. And so, the world kind of keeps on marching on, and you don't, you're in your bed. And, I have treated so many people in their 20s and 30s, who are losing multiple years or who have lost multiple years of their life. And, I hear that all the time. It's been 6 years. It's been 3 years. It's been, and, that is why I still do it, is because once they get well, it is so gratifying. And, it's so nice to see my patients who they don't need me anymore. And, I see them on social media or other ways of they're out living their life again, and, into their passions and back in school, or, a lot of times they change careers because, illness is one of those paths to enlightenment. Really see who's on your team, who sticks with you, what really helps you. And a lot of times those people want to turn around and get into a profession where they're helping people. I have so many people who want to become naturopathic doctors after they, get well, and, or become a health coach or something in that space, because along the way too, that's one of our other tenets is to teach people. So docere is the Latin word for doctor, and that means to teach. And so we really believe, we're teaching people about their body, about their genetics, about what they need, to get well. And so, when patients have bronchitis every winter, right? It's like, and suddenly they have a year where they don't have bronchitis because, they learned what they need to do before that happens and how to stay well. And it's like, that's really that teaching part of like, we're not creating a dependence on us to like, come see me every time you get that illness. I'll give you that prescription, or give you that IV. It's like, I would rather people, figure out how to not get sick every year and really teach them. And, that's not a great from some people's perspective, it's not a good business model, right? To really heal
No.
people and they're not your
Yeah.
patient anymore.
Yeah.
But, I remember learning in school, it's like when you really help people heal, they go and tell people, right? They'll
Yes.
go and tell
Yes.
that next person who they see
Right.
struggling with bronchitis. Oh, I used to have that too. I used to get
Right.
that. And so, I have found that I've never really needed to advertise. Word of mouth is so powerful. You treat people and listen to their stories and help them change. They remember that, because, being sick and unwell is not a good feeling. People really, it's hard mentally, it can be hard physically, and, loss of work, loss of income, things like that. And so,
There's a huge financial toll to all this, to a lot of chronic illness, to
yeah.
severe illness, right? Huge financial toll. And even the burden on the healthcare system. All of that is just, I mean, I think that we're in a space where we're ripe for reform or some sort of a different way to actually approach treating a lot of these illnesses.
But there's a lot of good out there.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of really bright things on the horizon. Thank you so much for spending time to come on the podcast and teach us about your work.
Thank you so much, Charlene.